So the idea of today is to work out whether carbon can be used to help partially fund community catchments or community plantings. And for people who are working on their own environmental groups through groups and things, getting to talk to a few farmers and find out what farmers are doing, and just network and find out what we're doing across the regions. So we've got 3 speakers today, and the first one is Sean Weaver from Ekos. And Sean, if you'd like to, everybody's had a bit of a biography on the thing that was sent out, but if you would like to introduce yourself and do your talking. Just want to make aware everybody that the meeting is being recorded. So yeah, no further ado, Sean.
Okay, let's get going. Hang on, it's not advancing. Here we go. So I'll just move straight past all of this stuff. Well, the reason for doing this is for conservation and climate resilience, and I'm just going to go straight into the kind of the realities of doing reforestation projects on farms and a range of different property types. But in order for me to sort of share that in any sort of logical detail, it's good to cover what the costs of these projects are and have a look at some of those details. So there's 3 major cost types when you do a project, especially a carbon project. But you've got the capital expenditure element, which is to build your carbon credit factory, which is another way of saying to build your forest. But fundamentally, the forest is going to create carbon credits, and you're going to use those carbon credits and sell them in order to fund the activity. And so you've got to establish your forest much of the time. Sometimes the forest is already established by nature. There's still a capital expenditure element to that, and I'll come back to that later. Then you've got your operational expenditures, which is essentially conservation management ongoing. And then you also have some opportunity costs, which is the benefits that a landowner has to give up if they're going to allocate land into a conservation land use instead of, for example, a farming land use. And if they're farming that land and have bought that land in order to farm it, they have a reasonable expectation to make a living off that land. And so we also need to cover that cost. So the capital expenditure costs are project development. And so you need to demonstrate eligibility to register in the emissions trading scheme, and then there's some compliance elements to that. What we do with people is we help them develop a business case, which is essentially a cost-benefit analysis to help them understand whether it's worthwhile proceeding. And then if they do want to proceed with a carbon project, then we need to develop a relatively detailed business plan and management plan so that everybody knows what's going on. And at this point, the project would be investment ready and implementation ready. This sort of process usually takes, a few months at the very least. And then when you get to the point where you do want to go ahead with a project, the first sort of expenditure for implementation would be actually to order your seedlings. And for native forests, you typically have to order those usually 2 years in advance of planting. And for some native species, it might need to be a bit longer, but typically allow 2 years ahead of time. So project implementation, you've got to buy your seedlings, you've got to get them delivered to the site, you've got to do some land preparation, usually some fencing, sometimes some vegetation removal like gorse. You might have to do some contour ripping, which is to sort of plough a furrow into the soil to make it easy for planting. You need to do usually some pre-planting pest control to help reduce the risk of rabbits eating your capital expenditure. Then you do your planting. You've got to do some survival monitoring to make sure that after the first summer, there's enough that have survived in order to register the project in the emissions trading scheme, because you've got to meet the forest definition of the emissions trading scheme, which is a certain minimum number of stems per hectare. And if a big bunch of them have died over the first summer in a sort of drought conditions, then you're going to have to replant, which is called blanking. And then you do that in the second planting season, so that's a year after the first planting, and it's quite a common thing to have to do blanking. Then you release your your trees, so weeding to make sure the long grass, rank grass doesn't choke them. And you'll need to do some post-planting pest control, again, rabbits and browsers and things, and ongoing management. If we look at the operational expenditure, then that's essentially conservation management, pest and weed control. And there's an element of, in some projects at least, measurement and certainly some reporting required for ETS registration. Opportunity costs are what the landowner has to give up in order to do conservation on their land. And as I said, if a farmer owns that land in order to make a living off that land, and they are considering retiring some pasture, then they'll be losing the revenue from that pasture, and so the carbon project really needs to replace that revenue. Some landowners are wealthy enough to not need to replace that revenue, or for one reason or another that part of the farm might not have been productive anyway. But we still need to consider the opportunity cost, and of course if you can't cover all of these costs, then it just doesn't work. Oftentimes you'll need to secure some investment to do the plantings, because you might need to borrow some money to do the plantings. And if the economics really don't stack up, then you're very unlikely to get that investment, because the person providing that money will say, well, prove to me that you can deliver my money back with interest within this time frame from the cash flows from the carbon project. And if you can't demonstrate that to that investor, you won't get their money and you won't be able to do the project. If you are that investor, then you still need to pay attention to this, because you kind of need to know whether or not you're going to break even on this, whether it's going to cover its own costs or not. And this is where it's important to just understand the economics. So an unpleasant fact in the indigenous reforestation sector is indigenous carbon credit projects are expensive to build, and they also produce carbon credits at a relatively slow rate. And so this graph shows you excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold. This graph shows the carbon credit production rates of different forest types using, this is the national average sequestration rates for different forest types. So exotic hardwoods are things like oaks or eucalypts or poplars, anything, a leafy tree that doesn't come from New Zealand. Pine, all know what pine is, and that's the blue line, and indigenous is the green line at the bottom. And as you can see, it's a much slower starter. It's a bit more of a long distance runner, whereas the exotics are your sprinters and the mix. But that green line there basically makes life hard economically for native carbon projects. And because life's hard for those project types, you don't have an industry out there busy going and planting these forests at the moment because of the economic challenges. I'll move into an example, say a case study. Now, I've given you a case study here of a 100-hectare project just as an example. Now, when you take into account all of the project development costs and operating costs, and then look at the carbon project through that lens, you've got your capital expenditure element, which is essentially to establish a forest. And it's not just buying the seedlings, it's also doing the land preparation, doing the planning, doing the pest control around planting time. All of those things do need to be funded. And this looks at that capital expenditure cost. And what we've got in this graph is different stem densities of native trees that are planted. And across to the left-hand side, you've got native afforestation at 8,000 stems per hectare, and that's quite a common density for ecological restoration projects. And you can see the capital expenditure per hectare is between $50,000 and $60,000. If you then halve the number of seedlings per hectare, then you're significantly reducing your capital expenditure costs. So that's NAF 4,000 stems a hectare. Moving into the middle of the graph, 2,000 stems a hectare, the capital expenditure costs come down again. And then you can see if only 1,000 stems a hectare, it's much lower. The project types on the right are when you do a mixed forest where some of the area is planted in exotics as an exotic woodlot. And in the NEAF 1000, that's where 20% of the area is planted in exotics and 80% of the area is planted in natives. And the one on the very right is when 80% is planted in natives and 20% exotic. So essentially the take-home message is obviously the high planting density for native reforestation is very, very expensive. And what the impact of that is that it's very hard to get the project to cover its own costs. then economically it essentially makes a loss. And so some people are willing to make a loss, others less so. If we look at the internal rate of return for the same blend of project types with native afforestation at 8,000 stems a hectare way on the left, numbers below zero, the graphs below zero, the lines below zero are showing you essentially an indication of profitability of these projects. And if they're below zero, then that means the internal rate of return is below zero. So in other words, it doesn't break even. And the three different colors are different carbon pricing scenarios. So the blue is starting at today's carbon price of, say, this year of, say, $78.40, and then rising at $1.50 a year every year across a 50-year period. CP2 is again starting at this year's carbon price, but rising at $4.75 every year across a 50-year cash flow. That's in addition to inflation. And then CP3 is the starting at today's carbon price, but rising at $8 a year every year across a 50-year cash flow, which is a pretty aggressive kind of crystal ball projection. Although at the moment, the government price controls have the carbon price rising at about $8 a year, but whether that can be sustained every year for 50 years is quite another matter. So that was the internal rate of return previously, and this is the net present value, which is another indication of profitability. In each case, the projects that are deeply unprofitable, in other words, they run essentially at a loss and the economics don't work, is when there's relatively high densities of natives planted. And when they start to work is when the natives are planted at a very low density, or when there's a mix of natives and exotics. What we do with landowners, or at least what we used to do with landowners, is try to maximize the area of natives planted, obviously. But if even at a low density, or let's say high density, you've got a negative internal rate of return. So it's a red number, it's not going to work. Maybe a medium density, it's a red number, but a smaller one, but it still doesn't work. And what I mean by work is that the test really is whether it breaks even and can deliver the internal rate of return required of that landowner or that investor. And they typically are above zero. At a low density, natives, you might be able to scrape up and get a 1% internal rate of return, but that may still not be enough for a landowner to be willing to forego grazing on that land. So we need to do something. So what we then do is put some rocket fuel in the carbon engine and introduce an exotic woodlot somewhere in the project. It doesn't have to be next door to the native plantings. It could be somewhere on the land, but it just needs to be somewhere in the investment model. And suddenly the internal rate of return goes up. And then we ask the landowner or the investor, well, what is the kind of stop-go threshold for the internal rate of return? And we just keep on adding the woodlot until it gets to that return threshold. And for example, if it's 10%, then we know how many hectares of exotic woodlot we need to put in the project in order to fund all of that native planting that we're trying to do. Because remember, if we don't put the exotic woodlot in there, then we just can't do it. So the purpose of the exotic woodlot is to fund the natives, but also, last time I checked, wood's pretty handy, and many farmers will have woodlots on their land already, and having a woodlot on your land is not an unheard of thing, especially if it can help fund the native reforestation you want to do. And of course, producing wood and timber is good for producing jobs and employment. So how would we manage the woodlot? We'd plant that woodlot all up in year 1, and then in year 15 we would take 10% out and then replant that 10% area in natives. So the natives are green, and the exotics are blue. And then if you do that every 5 years, you'll do the maths and you'll figure out that actually across a 60-year period, you've gone from, for the woodlot only, you've gone from 100% exotic to 100% native. Now, bearing in mind that this actually, of course, if you put some totara in there, you've got a potential future cash flow from sustainably managed native timbers into the future. And this is really important if you want to maintain your land value. For some farmers, they don't mind if that land value goes way down into a non-productive use. Other landowners, it does matter to them and they want to maintain land value. And one way to maintain land value is to plant species that you could potentially harvest in the future for wood. That rocket fuel and the carbon engine option has been taken away from us at the moment because the government is currently proposing to ban the use of exotics in the permanent forest category of the emissions trading scheme. And so all of the projects that we've been doing that uses this method are now on hold and be on hold for the, until the government changes the rules, or if the government does stick with the plan to ban exotics, then those projects will all fail and they won't proceed. And the thing is that the economics of natives on their own are very, very challenging. So that's a key take-home message. So the large print of, carbon projects to fund native forests, that sounds great. But usually in life, the large print gives and the fine print takes away. And the fine print of the economics of native reforestation are what makes this a very difficult thing to do. Now, you can also do native regeneration, let nature do the planting. So one option is to lock the gate and walk away from, say, a paddock of pasture. Maybe it's a bit of a scrubby paddock that's not very good for farming anyway. So if you shut the gate and walk away, you could let nature do the planting. But the challenge is, though, that the time between shutting the gate and getting nature to finish doing that planting is going to be 10 to 15 to 20 years, depending on what part of the country you're in. And so you've got to then decide, well, am I willing to give up on any revenue on that land for all of that time? So that's the challenge. If in fact nature did the planting already and you just want to wrap a carbon project around it, then that's an option as well. But you've also got the challenges of having to age that forest. So even though nature planted the forest for free, you've got to spend money on doing a vegetation age assessment to prove to the emissions trading scheme that it's eligible to register in the emissions trading scheme. So prove that the forest was established after the 31st of December 1989. And in addition to that, you need to prove the age of each different piece of forest, because you need to know the age of the vegetation in order to know what carbon sequestration rate it is. And so that requires going on the land and doing some science. And that can get expensive depending on how big the area is. We did a site that was about 100 hectares last year, and that cost about $25,000 to do that vegetation age assessment. For smaller areas, that's lower cost, and what we do with landowners, invite them to do the field work, and we just provide the methodology. They then send us a courier pack full of discs, in other words, stump discs, because you've got to cut some trees down when you do these vegetation age assessments in order to age that vegetation. For larger trees, you can use tree corers, but we're typically not talking about large trees. We're talking about, often scrubby vegetation. And so you do need to cut stem discs and then courier them to us. We do the analysis, and then we can determine the age of the vegetation. And then once you've done all that for native regeneration, you can then register it in the ETS. And once you submit your application to register, you've then got to wait many months before you hear back from MPI. And it's not uncommon to have to wait a year or longer before the MPI will come back and confirm whether or not you're eligible to register or whether they accept the registration. So that's a bit of a 100-metre sprint through this sector. I'm happy to take some questions.
Sean, just running through really simply. So your native area that you might want to generate some income on, and you've already put it in place, has to be over a hectare and the minimum of, or average of, 30 metres. And approximately at the moment, how much is that generating per year?
For a very small project that's only a few hectares of size, it's typically not even worth your while to put in the effort to do it, because the carbon revenues are so small that they won't even cover your administrative costs to do it. And plus, remember, when you become a beneficiary of the carbon market, you also carry a carbon liability. So you've got this carbon liability to also manage. So typically for small projects, it's just often not worthwhile to even bother. It doesn't mean to say that you wouldn't do the planting, but I don't know. It's just the economics are very, very tough. So the revenue is very small. So I mean, for example, in the first few years, the carbon revenues per hectare per year, the volume of carbon credits are going to be 1 or 2 tons if you're lucky in the first few years. It'll rise to sort of maybe 4 or 5 tonnes for a while, but that's 4 or 5, let's say it's 5 tonnes. You multiply that by $70 and it's only a few $100s of revenue. When you've gone through all of this jiggery pokery of effort to register the project and all of that. So I think that's a a really important thing to consider, is just really, is it worthwhile putting the effort? Because honestly, carbon projects are not a piece of cake, and especially when they're native forest carbon.
Okay. Are there any questions? Feel free to put them in chat or raise your hand.
I've got one. So, Sean, how much of the investment that are farmers going through the banks with? So I've just learned about these green bonds and accessing the green bonds through the banks, and how does that impact the farmer's decision? What's the bank's role in that, and how does that look when it comes to the ATS and government?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. A green bond is essentially just a debt financing instrument, so it's a way of raising capital. So think of a bond, think of a loan, they're not really that different to each other. And it's just a bond will have a particular interest rate that's required of the bond issuer, just like a bank debt will have an interest rate requirement. So it's not really that different. Bonds are really quite useful when something gets quite big in scale. So if you're doing 30,000 hectares a year, bonds are useful ways to raise capital. But when it's a really little project, bonds are less likely to be an instrument that you'd use. The thing is, if you want to borrow from a bank, farmers all have access to money from rural banks at a relatively low interest rate. So it's useful to consider that, because if you have to go to a private investor, you then have to it just gets a whole lot more complicated, and they typically charge much higher interest rates than banks, because they're usually carrying a whole lot more risk. And so the more risk that an investor will carry, the more interest they're going to charge on their money. And then the more expensive the project is, and the harder it is for you to remember to meet that internal rate of return threshold. It just gets harder and harder and harder.
So there's a question here, and it relates also to something like the Muthuri catchment as well. So the question comes from Eric, and are there opportunities to bundle smaller sites together to share the administrative overhead costs and make them more viable as a collective?
In principle, yes. Because even a large landowner who wants to do projects in the ETS will often have a bunch of different areas that are registered in the ETS on their land. And so, yeah, the short answer is yes, you can. The longer answer is that it does just get complicated, because then you've got to have many different landowners who are beneficiaries of an investment, and then you've got to do all the legal sort of stuff around that. So that's doable, but just administratively can be somewhat challenging. Roger, you're on mute, Roger. You're talking to yourself nicely.
Thanks.
I can tease Roger, because Roger and I work together.
Yeah, there's another element to that answer for Annette, and that is that a carbon accounting area has to be a minimum of a hectare, has to be wider than 30 metres, and it has to contain eligible species that will reach 5 metres and have a canopy at maturity of 30% on each hectare, 30% canopy cover per hectare. If you've got some plantings, say some riparian plantings, that individually are less than a hectare, then they are not eligible unless they can be joined together in such a way that they constitute more than a hectare, in which case that area, contiguous area, is greater than a hectare. So the only way to do riparian planting that is eligible is to ensure that you've got some species in there that are going to provide you with decent canopies, and make your margin each side of the river at least or stream at least 10 metres, so that the distance between the fences on either side of the stream is 20 metres, and then allow a canopy radius of 5 metres on each side that provides you with the 30 metres minimum, and then make it long enough to be at least a hectare. So it's a little bit technical. The other interesting thing is that a lot of people don't realise what the implications are of a 30% canopy cover per hectare. Let's say if we're going to do a native planting and start with planting some exotics, and the exotics are eucalypts, and the eucalypts are, say, 12 metres diameter, canopy diameter, crown diameter at maturity, then we only need to plant about 40 trees per hectare in order to obtain that stocking. We only need to plant 40 trees a hectare in order to get the 30% canopy cover at maturity. We don't have to go to the extent of planting standard forest densities of 3 metres by 3 metres or 4 by 3. We can actually spread our exotics quite widely so that at maturity they are still gaining the carbon and as an eligible forest.
Excellent. We've got a question from Barbara. What happens when a flood or a fire goes through and destroys the trees? What is your liability there? And I'll have that as the last question, and we'll be getting ready for Olivia.
Sure. I mean, you've got a problem when that happens, because if you've lost some of your forest, then you've got what was regarded as a reversal. So your forest might suddenly become ineligible because it's smaller and might not meet the eligibility requirements anymore. Plus, you've got these emissions that come from the event that happened, and you may have to compensate for that. And so this is also why people would take out carbon insurance for it. But I think that the take-home message is that if the economics, and we've done many assessments for riparian plantings around the country, and if the economics did work, then essentially that's what we'd be doing. We'd be doing lots of it, but the economics essentially don't work, and they're really difficult, and that's why we just aren't every day getting up organising a lot of riparian plantings funded by carbon markets, because it's just very difficult. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of not such happy news, but that's just the fact of the matter. It is hard, and as the carbon price rises, it will gradually get more doable, but the economics are still going to be challenging.
But if you've already planted them, and if you've already got your community planting and it meets these criteria,
yeah, then you can retrofit a carbon project around